This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, you've sent us a ton of stuff about Japanese-American life in the U.S., but, before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And that's a period that often gets kind of lost, the shadow of everything that happened afterwards.
Absolutely.
So we're going to, really uncover what daily life was like in the decades leading up to World War II.
It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah. Buckle up.
Yeah, these sources are incredible.
They're amazing, vivid, and sometimes kind of surprising.
Definitely. A story of resilience, but also a story of some pretty deep prejudice.
Yeah.
And that's something we can't shy away from.
No, absolutely not. So let's just start at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Why did Japanese people immigrate to the U.S. in the first place?
Right.
I'm picturing late 19th century Japan.
Yeah.
It seems like a huge leap.
Huge. And it was. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, had thrust Japan into modernization,
Mm-hmm.
but it also created a lot of economic hardship, particularly for people in rural areas.
So was the government encouraging them to leave?
They were actually encouraging emigration as a solution.
Wow.
So you can imagine the upheaval, right?
Yeah.
Traditional farming life disrupted, families facing these really difficult choices.
So it wasn't just about, seeking opportunity. It was about escaping hardship.
Exactly.
And I guess the U.S. must seem like the land of promise.
Oh, absolutely. Especially California and Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
They were booming, needed workers desperately, agriculture, fishing, railroads.
Yeah.
All those tough jobs that fueled that westward expansion.
Right.
And you have to remember the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That created a huge labor vacuum.
Okay, so the timing was kind of perfect.
In a way, yeah, at least from a purely economic standpoint.
But I'm sensing it wasn't just about economics, was it?
No, not at all.
What else was going on?
Well, this is what's so fascinating, right? The very success of the Japanese immigrants, it actually led to this rising hostility.
Wait, really? So their success caused problems?
Yeah, so by the early 1900s, you've got these thriving Japanese communities all along the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
That visibility, it sparked resentment and fear among certain segments of American society.
So instead of being welcomed for, working hard, contributing,
Right.
they became a target.
Yeah, it's a real clash with that, land of opportunity ideal, isn't it?
It's a huge contradiction.
It is. On one hand, you have that American dream narrative.
Like work hard, prosper, assimilate.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have this reality of really deep-seated racial prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
This fear of the other
Right.
taking over, succeeding where others struggle.
So their success kind of exposed the hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
At the heart of it all.
Yeah.
And that prejudice, it wasn't just talk, right?
Yeah.
It manifested in concrete ways. I'm thinking of the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, which sounds very diplomatic, but
Right.
our sources suggest it was anything but.
Yeah, a little bit Orwellian,
Uh-huh.
It actually restricted the number of Japanese laborers allowed into the U.S.
Oh.
However, it did allow family members to immigrate,
Right.
which kind of unintentionally strengthened Japanese-American communities.
How so?
Well, instead of just temporary workers coming over, you had families putting down roots,
Right.
building a future.
So it's almost like that restriction backfired
It did, in a way. Yeah.
by creating this more permanent presence
And that fueled even more anxiety, absolutely.
amongst people who were already wary.
Exactly. And those anxieties, they just reached a boiling point with the 1924 Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act.
Right.
This was a huge turning point.
In what way?
It was a complete shutdown of Japanese immigration.
Wow, a complete shutdown.
Yeah.
What drove that? Such a drastic measure.
Well, it was a time of rising nativism,
Mm-hmm.
fueled by economic anxieties and racial prejudice.
Right.
So people were looking for scapegoats.
And immigrants are easy targets.
Sadly, yes. And the Johnson-Reed Act, it wasn't just about Japan.
Yeah.
It really limited immigration from all over, Asian countries, parts of Europe, too.
So this is part of a broader wave.
A huge wave of xenophobia sweeping the nation.
It's pretty chilling.
Yeah.
Think about how fear and prejudice can be used to exclude entire groups of people.
Absolutely.
And all this time, Japanese Americans were trying to build lives, raise families, contribute to their communities. We're talking about different generations here, navigating this really complex landscape.
Right.
The Issei, Nisei, and Kibei,
Yes.
our sources mention those terms a lot, so maybe we should just take a minute to break them down.
Sure, yeah. So the Issei were that first generation, the ones born in Japan, who actually immigrated to the U.S., often, with dreams of returning home wealthy. But with those immigration restrictions tightening, many of them had to kind of adjust their dreams.
Yeah.
Putting down roots, building a life in a land that wasn't always welcoming.
Imagine that shift from seeking temporary fortune to, building a whole life.
Yeah.
And then their children, the Nisei, are caught between two worlds.
Exactly. Born in the U.S., they were American citizens, but often faced this, cultural tug of war.
I can imagine.
Speaking English at school, embracing American culture.
Yeah.
But still honoring your parents' Japanese heritage at home.
Right. The traditions, the language.
Absolutely.
That's a lot to reconcile.
It is. And then you've got the Kibei, who add this whole other layer.
Right.
The Kibeis are fascinating.
Tell me more.
So these are Nisei children who are sent back to Japan for part of their education.
Oh, wow.
Often living with relatives or attending these special schools.
Okay.
But then upon returning to the U.S., they face suspicion from both sides.
Oh, wow.
Some Japanese Americans saw them as too Japanese, and then white Americans questioned their loyalty because of their time abroad.
It's a no-win situation.
Yeah, real paradox, right?
It is. Can you imagine feeling caught between two cultures?
Yeah.
Never fully belonging to either.
It's tough.
And this is all before the war even enters the picture. It's amazing.
Yeah, it really is.
Makes you wonder, where did these communities actually settle? How did they manage to thrive amidst all this pressure and restriction?
Well, by 1941, the Japanese American population was mostly concentrated on the West Coast.
Okay.
Especially California, about 110,000 people.
Wow.
Hawaii had a large population too, around 150,000.
Okay.
And then there were these smaller communities scattered across the Midwest and East Coast.
So a truly nationwide presence.
It was, yeah.
But California seems like the kind of focal point in this story.
It does, yeah.
Our sources, they really highlight that tension between their success and the discrimination there.
Yeah, and California really reveals both the incredible achievements and the blatant injustices they faced.
Right.
You remember those early immigrants drawn to the labor jobs? Well, many saved up enough to buy land and become farmers.
And they were incredibly successful.
I've heard stories about, how they transformed barren land into profitable farms.
Absolutely, using all these innovative techniques.
Yeah.
And by the 1930s, they were producing nearly 40% of California's crops.
That's incredible.
Yeah, they were known for their incredible work ethic and their high-quality produce.
But that very success, it fueled that resentment.
It did, yeah.
It played into those existing anxieties
Completely.
about economic competition, racial difference.
Exactly.
Like a cruel twist of fate.
It is.
Being punished for achieving the very thing they were told to do.
Yeah.
Contribute to the American economy.
Right.
But their story isn't just about farms and fields, is it?
No, not at all.
Our sources mention this much more diverse picture.
Yeah, much more diverse.
What else was going on?
While farming was significant, they were also entrepreneurs, business owners, community builders. As those land laws made farming harder, many moved to urban areas.
Created these vibrant businesses.
So imagine bustling city streets, shops with Japanese signs, like a real mix of cultures.
It was a dynamic mix.
Yeah.
They ran grocery stores, restaurants, laundries, essential businesses that every community needs.
Right.
And despite facing those barriers, some even pursued higher education.
Oh.
Became doctors, lawyers, teachers.
It's amazing how adaptable and determined they were.
Absolutely, yeah.
They were building a life, contributing in so many ways, all while facing this discrimination.
Yeah.
It's an incredible story of resilience.
It is.
But we can't ignore the darker side.
No, we can't.
The discrimination wasn't just an attitude.
Right.
It was embedded in the system itself.
Absolutely.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. We need to confront those legal barriers they faced because that sets the stage for everything that was to come. California's Alien Land Law of 1913 is a prime example.
Right.
It was literally designed to prevent Asian immigrants from owning land. It was a blatant attempt to undermine their economic progress.
So even though they were contributing so much to the agricultural success of the state, They weren't allowed to own the very land they were working.
It's infuriating, isn't it?
It really is.
It was a really unjust law aimed at keeping them in this subservient position.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to note that many did find ways around it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, often by putting land in the names of their American-born Nisei children.
Oh, interesting.
It speaks to their resourcefulness and their determination.
It's like they were constantly having to find loopholes, workarounds, just to exist.
Absolutely, just to build a life.
And it wasn't just about land ownership, was it?
No.
Our sources talk about other forms of discrimination that were just part of their daily reality.
Yeah, totally. Segregated schools, housing restrictions, job discrimination fueled by labor unions.
It's a lot.
It was a constant battle. Imagine being denied opportunities simply because of your race, your ancestry.
It just shows how prejudice wasn't just an individual thing.
Right.
It was woven into the institutions, the laws.
The very fabric of society.
And historians, they debate what the underlying causes of this discrimination were.
They do, yeah.
Like, what were some of the arguments?
Well, some argue that economic jealousy was the primary driver.
So fear of Japanese Americans outcompeting white Americans.
Exactly.
So it wasn't just about race. It was about power, about maintaining a certain hierarchy.
Right.
A social and economic hierarchy.
Exactly. They highlight that systemic racism that permeated American society at the time and really laid the groundwork for what was to come.
But there are other perspectives on this too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like what?
While acknowledging that discrimination, some historians emphasize that Japanese Americans remained loyal to the U.S. And made significant contributions to the economy and culture. They point to the resilience of the community, their ability to thrive amidst adversity.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white.
Never.
There are these multiple perspectives, often conflicting, and it's our job to grapple with that complexity.
I think so, yeah. We need to understand both the systemic racism and the remarkable strength of the Japanese American community in the face of it.
It's like this balancing act.
It is.
Acknowledging both the darkness and the light.
Yeah.
So by 1941, Japanese Americans had built a life here.
Yeah.
Created families, contributed to American society.
Yeah.
But decades of this racism and legal barriers.
Right.
It left them so vulnerable.
Yeah, incredibly vulnerable.
They'd thrived, but they were also exposed.
They were.
Like ready to be scapegoated when the world changed.
And shifted, did.
And that shift, of course, came with Pearl Harbor. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to let everything we've just discussed kind of sink in.
Absolutely.
The story we've uncovered so far, it's really a roller coaster.
It is.
This blend of hope, achievement, and then heartbreaking injustice. Yeah. It reveals a lot about the complexities of the American experience.
For sure. It challenges us to confront our past, to understand how prejudice and discrimination take root, and how easily fear can be manipulated.
Yeah. It's also a story that celebrates resilience, adaptation, and the unwavering spirit of a community determined to make a life for themselves.
Absolutely. Even when that land wasn't always welcoming, that's what makes it so compelling. It forces us to confront these difficult truths, but also celebrate the strength of the human spirit.
It's amazing. We're going to take a short break.
Okay.
But when we come back, we'll explore how Pearl Harbor changed everything for Japanese Americans.
Yeah.
And the devastating consequences that followed.
Looking forward to it. And it did, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, it's like you can't talk about this period without acknowledging how that single event it changed everything for Japanese Americans, regardless of, their generation, how assimilated they were, or their loyalty to the U.S.
It's like this dark cloud just descends.
Yeah.
And it turns suspicion into this outright hostility.
Right.
I remember learning about the internment camps in school, but back then, it felt so disconnected from, this pre-war history.
I get that.
We've been talking about.
Yeah.
Now, it just feels like this direct consequence, like the culmination of all that prejudice.
Absolutely.
And the legal maneuvering.
You're right. To connect those dots, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
The fear and racism that had been simmering for decades, it just boiled over after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And suddenly, Japanese Americans were seen as the enemy, a threat to national security.
Yeah.
It didn't matter that most of them had nothing to do with the attack and were, in fact, American citizens.
It's mind-boggling, the sheer scale of it.
It is.
Over 120,000 people forcibly removed from their homes.
It's unbelievable.
Businesses, their lives, all based on their ancestry.
Yeah.
Did anyone speak out against this?
They did. There were voices of dissent.
Really?
Yeah, thankfully. Some politicians, some religious leaders, civil rights groups, you know, they recognized the unconstitutionality of it, the immorality.
Right.
But you have to remember the context, right?
Yeah.
America had just been attacked, and fear was a very, very powerful motivator.
Of course.
So those dissenting voices, they were largely drowned out by this wave of, you know, wartime hysteria and fear-mongering.
It makes you think about how easily fear can be manipulated, you know.
Absolutely.
And how quickly rights can be eroded when there's a crisis.
Yeah, it's a scary thought.
And for Japanese Americans, this wasn't just like temporary relocation.
No, it wasn't.
It was about the loss of everything they built.
Yeah.
The fracturing of communities, the trauma.
Right, that would just reverberate for generations.
Oh, it's hard to even imagine.
The internment camps, you know, they weren't just geographically isolated. They represented this total rupture in the fabric of Japanese American life. Families uprooted, forced to live in these cramped, unsanitary conditions.
Wow.
Stripped of their dignity, their autonomy. Imagine being forced to abandon your home, your business, your life's work.
Yeah.
And just having zero control over your future.
It's hard to grasp the emotional weight of that experience.
It is, yeah.
To be treated as a traitor in your own country.
Yeah.
To have your loyalty questioned just because of your heritage.
And remember, this wasn't a homogenous group.
Right.
You had Issei, who had spent decades building businesses.
Yeah.
Nisei, who were American-born citizens.
Right.
Kibei, struggling with their dual identities, all lumped together, labeled as a threat.
It's crazy.
Yeah, stripped of their individual stories and their achievements.
It's such a tragic irony, you know.
It is.
Considering how much they'd contributed to American society.
Right.
As those nationalist historians point out. Yeah. Like, they'd farmed land, built businesses, raised families, only to be labeled as enemies when it was convenient, you know?
It's truly heartbreaking.
It is.
That's why understanding this pre-war history is so important. It helps us see the internment not as this, like, isolated thing, but as the culmination of decades of this xenophobia and discrimination, a direct result of all those legal restrictions and social prejudices we talked about.
It's a chilling reminder that history isn't just about dates and events.
No, it's not.
It's about the choices we make, the ideologies we embrace, and the consequences that just ripple through time.
For sure.
But even in the face of such injustice, you know, did Japanese Americans resist?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's important to acknowledge that resistance took many forms.
Okay.
Some, like Fred Korematsu, he challenged the internment orders in court.
Wow.
His case actually went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow, really?
Yeah, but it was unsuccessful at the time.
So even in the face of, like, such power, there were those who refused to be silenced, you know?
Absolutely.
Who stood up for their rights.
They did, even if it meant risking further punishment.
And were there other forms of resistance too?
Oh, for sure.
What else was going on?
Well, some Japanese Americans refused to sign loyalty oaths.
Oh, wow.
You know, they saw them as a betrayal of their heritage and an insult to their citizenship.
Yeah.
Others organized protests within the camps.
Wow.
Demanding better conditions and recognition of their rights.
It's remarkable that even in those spaces, stripped of their freedom, they still found ways to resist.
They did, yeah, to make their voices heard.
Were there more subtle forms of resistance as well?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Like what?
Sometimes it wasn't overt, you know, or confrontational.
Yeah.
It was about preserving cultural traditions, keeping their language and customs alive.
Yeah.
Creating art and music as a form of expression and resilience.
Wow.
Imagine the power of a brushstroke. You
Yeah.
know?
A song, a shared story in the face of such dehumanizing circumstances.
Yeah.
It's a real testament to the human spirit, that ability to find hope.
Yeah.
Even in the darkest situations.
And it reminds us that history is never just a story of victims.
No, it's not.
It's also a story of those who resist.
Yeah.
Who fight back.
Absolutely.
Who refuse to let injustice define them.
Oh.
But the story doesn't end with the closing of the internment camps, does it?
No, it doesn't.
What happened to Japanese Americans when they were finally allowed to return home?
Well, that's a question that leads us into the next chapter, a chapter filled with both challenges and triumphs.
Okay.
But that's a story for another time.
Indeed. and one we'll be exploring in just a moment. But for now, let's just take a pause, reflect on what we've learned.
Yeah.
This story of Japanese Americans before and during the war, it's a testament to the power of hope, the resilience of the human spirit,
Absolutely.
and the importance of remembering and learning from even the darkest chapters of our history.
We must never forget the injustices they endured.
Yeah.
But we should also celebrate their strength, their contributions, and their unwavering belief in the American ideal, even when that ideal failed them.
We've really journeyed through this, complex and challenging period.
Yeah.
From those early days of immigration to, like, the vibrancy of those pre-war communities.
Right.
And then the just jarring injustice of internment.
It's a lot. But the story doesn't end with the closing of those camps, does it?
It doesn't. Japanese Americans faced a whole new set of challenges.
Like what?
Well, when they were allowed to return home, imagine returning to a world that had moved on without you.
Right.
Often finding their homes and businesses lost, their communities shattered.
It's like adding insult to injury.
It is.
Having to rebuild from scratch after everything was taken away.
Yeah.
Was there any support? Was there any acknowledgement of the wrong that was done? Sadly, very little initially. For decades, the internment was a taboo subject, swept under the rug of history.
Wow.
A lot of Japanese Americans, especially the Issei generation, were really reluctant to speak about their experiences.
Yeah.
They carried the burden of trauma and shame in silence.
That silence itself is a form of trauma.
It is, yeah, to have your story, your pain ignored,
Mm-hmm.
minimized by the very society that inflicted it.
And, I mean, it speaks to those complex dynamics within the community, right? Like some people might have felt it was best to move on, not dwell on the past.
Great.
Others, I imagine, struggled with the scars, the loss of trust, the feeling of betrayal.
Absolutely, and it shows how trauma can manifest in so many ways.
Yeah. Our sources do mention a shift happening in the 60s and 70s, a breaking of the silence. What sparked that?
The civil rights movement played a huge role.
Oh, okay.
It emboldened a new generation of Japanese Americans to speak out, to demand recognition and justice.
So, like, a second wave of resistance.
Yeah, you could say that.
This time, focused on reclaiming their narrative.
Absolutely, yeah.
Demanding accountability.
Yeah.
Did they gain any traction? Like, did the government ever formally apologize?
It was a long and hard-fought battle, but yes.
Right.
In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. This was huge.
Yeah.
It formally apologized for the internment and offered reparations to surviving internees.
That must have been an incredibly powerful moment, after all that time.
It was, yeah.
To have that suffering validated.
Absolutely.
That injustice acknowledged. But even with a formal apology, I imagine those wounds ran deep.
Oh, they do. The internment remains this deeply painful chapter in American history.
A cautionary tale.
Yeah, about the dangers of prejudice and the fragility of civil liberties.
And it feels so relevant today.
You know?
When you see how fear and division are exploited, often for political gain.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The lessons of the internment are still relevant.
Yeah.
We need to be vigilant to challenge discrimination wherever we see it.
Yeah.
To stand up for the rights of all Americans.
Right, regardless of their background.
Exactly.
Their beliefs.
It's a stark reminder that history isn't just something we learn about.
Right.
It's something we live with, shapes our present, our future.
And that's why these conversations are so important.
I think so, too. By understanding, the complexities of Japanese American history.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can create a more just and equitable society.
For everyone.
Yeah.
It's been a heavy but incredibly important deep dive.
It has, yeah.
From those early days of immigration to the vibrancy of those communities, the injustice of internment, and then the fight for recognition and justice.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's a story that challenges us, inspires us.
It does.
And reminds us that the fight for civil liberties is ongoing.
It is.
It's a responsibility we all share.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We really encourage you to continue exploring this story.
Yes, please do.
There's always more to learn, more voices to hear.
More perspectives to consider.
And on that note, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.